They say when terrible things happen, we should accept them as God's will. That suffering is part of a divine plan we cannot understand. That questioning why is the same as questioning God himself. And I was taught this from birth. Was raised to believe that acceptance was virtue. That submission to fate was faith. That struggling against what God had decided was pride and sin. And I believed it so deeply that when they came for me, when they accused me and tried me and condemned me, I accepted it because they said it was God's will. Accepted it because resisting seemed like resisting God. Accepted it because I had been trained my entire life to submit, to bow, to take what was given and call it blessing even when it felt like curse. And I accepted my sentence, accepted it with the resignation they called righteousness, accepted it with the surrender they called faith. But it did not feel like God's will. It felt like abandonment, felt like being thrown away by the God I had served faithfully. Felt like divine rejection disguised as divine plan. And I carried that acceptance to the scaffold, carried it through the execution, carried it into what should have been death. And only when I woke alive did I understand that what they called God's will was actually human cruelty. That what they called divine judgment was actually their convenience. That what they called faith was actually their mechanism for making victims complicit in their own destruction. And I had been taught to accept, to submit, to call my suffering holy, and this teaching had nearly killed me, had made me participate in my own execution, had made me grateful for my own destruction because I believed it was God's plan. And the anger I felt when I understood this was cleaner than any faith I had ever held. Was the rage of someone who realizes they were taught to be victim, trained to be sacrifice, raised to accept rather than resist, and I had accepted. And my acceptance had nearly destroyed me. And I would never accept anything again without questioning whose will was really being served. My name is Patience Goodwin, and I was born in Salem in 1671 to parents who were deeply devout, who believed that every aspect of life should be submitted to God's judgment, who taught me that my own desires and thoughts were suspect, were likely corrupted, were things to be suppressed rather than trusted. And I was raised to believe that goodness meant selflessness to the point of self-erasure. That virtue meant putting everyone else's needs above my own. That faith meant accepting whatever happened as God's plan regardless of how it felt. And I tried so hard to be good in the way they defined goodness. Tried to erase myself, tried to never want anything, tried to accept everything with gratitude. And I thought I was succeeding, thought I was becoming the righteous woman they wanted me to be. Thought my ability to submit without complaint was proof of my faith. And perhaps it was. Perhaps I had more faith than anyone. Had so much faith that I would have walked willingly to my own execution believing it was holy. And I nearly did. I very nearly did. And only accident and intervention saved me from my own acceptance. I was quiet and obedient and everything a girl in Salem should be. Was so unremarkable that people often forgot I was present. And this invisibility felt like success, felt like I was doing righteousness correctly. And I served my family without complaint, served the church without question, served God without doubt. And I was content in this service, was happy in a muted way, was satisfied with being nothing, with taking up no space, with making no demands, and I thought this was holiness. Thought this was what God wanted. Thought my ability to want nothing was the highest form of devotion. And no one corrected this belief. No one told me that wanting things was human and acceptable. That having desires was not corruption. That being a person rather than a servant was not sin. And so I continued being invisible, continued accepting, continued submitting, and I was 21 when this acceptance nearly killed me. Was 21 when I learned that what I called faith was actually the mechanism of my own destruction. The accusation came from nowhere, came from a woman I barely knew, came for reasons I never fully understood. And it started because I was present when something unfortunate happened, was simply there when someone's child took sick, was in the room when fever struck. And because I was there, I became convenient explanation, became the cause by proximity, became witch because someone needed witch and I was available. And the accusation was presented as certainty, was spoken with such conviction that people believed it immediately. And I was taken to prison, and I sat there trying to understand what I had done wrong, trying to identify my sin, trying to figure out how to repent. And it took me days to realize that there was no sin to identify, no wrong to acknowledge, no repentance possible because I had done nothing. And this understanding should have made me fight, should have made me resist. But instead I thought perhaps this was test. Perhaps God was testing my faith through unjust accusation. Perhaps my role was to accept even false accusation with the same submission I would accept true judgment. And so I accepted the accusation, accepted the imprisonment, accepted the trial that was coming. And I prayed for strength to endure what God had decided for me. And I did not once pray for rescue or justice or truth, because I had been taught that praying for what you wanted was selfish, was putting your desires above God's plan. And I would not be selfish, would not be demanding, would accept whatever came and trust that God knew better than I did what I needed. My parents came to see me once, came to the prison and sat across from me in the visiting room, and my mother cried and my father looked stern, and they asked me if I understood why this was happening, if I could see God's purpose in my suffering, and I said I did not understand, but I trusted that God had reasons. And my father said that was good, that was the right answer, that acceptance was the path to salvation. And my mother said she was proud of me for not fighting, for not making this worse by resisting, for accepting God's will with grace. And they said they would pray for me, would ask God to give me strength to face whatever He had planned. And they left me there in the cell, and I felt abandoned. But I told myself that feeling abandoned was testing my faith. Was God checking whether I would trust Him even when I felt alone? And I pushed down the feeling, pushed down the hurt, pushed down the very human need for my parents to fight for me, to defend me, to do something other than praise my acceptance of injustice. And I told myself their response was righteous, was correct, was what good Christians did. And if I felt hurt by it, that was my weakness, my sin, my failure to truly submit. The trial was brief, and I barely defended myself. Barely spoke, except to say that I accepted whatever judgment was given, that I trusted God's plan, that I would submit to whatever the court decided. And this submission was seen as either confession or resignation, was interpreted as evidence of guilt because innocence would fight, would resist, would demand justice. And my acceptance seemed like acknowledgement that I deserved what was coming. And they found me guilty quickly, found me guilty of witchcraft and sentenced me to hang. And I accepted the sentence, accepted it out loud, said I would submit to God's will, and the magistrate looked pleased. Looked like my acceptance validated his judgment, made it easier, made it clear that even I agreed this was right. And I walked back to my cell thinking I had done well, had shown faith, had proven my devotion, and it was only that night, only in the darkness alone, that I began to wonder if acceptance was actually what God wanted, or if it was what people wanted. if submission served God or served those who benefited from my submission. And this thought was terrifying, was questioning everything I had been taught, was the first small crack in the foundation of beliefs I had built my entire life upon. The minister came to see me the day before my execution, came to prepare my soul, to hear my confession, to ensure I died in a state of grace. And he asked me if I understood that my execution was God's will, if I accepted it as part of his divine plan, and I said yes, said I accepted it. And he looked satisfied and said that my acceptance proved I was actually innocent. That guilty witches fought and denied, but innocent victims accepted with faith. And this confused me deeply. Because if my acceptance proved innocence, then why was I still being executed? Why did proof of innocence not result in freedom? And I asked him this. Asked him why innocent acceptance led to the same outcome as guilty denial. And he said that was not for us to question, that God's ways were mysterious, that my innocence would be rewarded in heaven even if it was punished on earth. And I should be grateful that I was dying innocent, should see this execution as martyrdom rather than justice. And I tried to accept this explanation, tried to believe that dying innocent was somehow better than living accused. But something in me resisted. Something small and quiet began to say that this was wrong, that calling murder martyrdom did not make it holy, that my acceptance was not faith but surrender, was not virtue but the success of my training, was me being complicit in my own destruction because I had been taught that compliance was godliness. I spent my last night trying to pray, trying to find peace in acceptance, trying to believe that tomorrow when they hanged me, it would be God's plan rather than human evil. And I could not do it. Could not make myself believe anymore. Could not maintain the faith that had sustained me my entire life. And this loss felt like another death, felt like losing God, felt like being abandoned by the only constant I had ever trusted. And I wept for the loss of faith, wept for the understanding that I had been taught lies, wept for all the years I had spent making myself small and calling it holy. And I wept too for the girl I had been, the girl who believed that goodness meant erasure, who thought that wanting nothing was virtue, who accepted suffering as gift. And that girl died that night in the cell, died before the execution. Died when I finally understood that what I called God's will was actually just people using God's name to justify what they wanted to do anyway. And I had accepted it, had participated in it, had made it easier for them by submitting. And my submission had not been faith but training, had been the successful indoctrination of someone taught from birth that accepting harm was holiness. They came for me at dawn and they led me to the scaffold, and I walked in silence, walked without the peace I had expected, walked angry rather than resigned. And this anger felt wrong, felt like sin, felt like I was failing in my final test, but I could not suppress it. Could not return to acceptance now that I had seen through it. And I climbed the scaffold thinking about all the times I had been told to accept, all the times my own needs had been dismissed as selfishness, all the times suffering had been called blessing. And I understood that I had been taught to be victim, had been raised to accept harm, had been trained to call oppression God's will. And this understanding made me furious, made me want to fight, made me want to resist. But it was too late for fighting, too late for resistance. And the noose went around my neck, and the minister asked if I had any last words, and I said yes. Said I had been taught to accept this as God's will, but I did not believe that anymore. Said I thought God would not require innocent people to accept death with gratitude. Said I thought what was happening was not God's will but human cruelty. And I saw shock on the minister's face, saw disapproval from the crowd. Saw my parents looking horrified that I would question at the very end. And the minister said I was proving my corruption by rejecting God's plan, by fighting against divine judgment. And I said I was not fighting God, but fighting people who used God's name to justify murder. And then they pulled the lever and I fell and darkness came. And my last thought was that I had finally resisted, had finally refused to accept, had finally said no. And that no felt more righteous than any acceptance I had ever performed. But death was not the end. I woke in darkness with my throat burning and my body aching, woke to hands pulling me up, woke to voices saying I had been saved, had been cut down after they declared me dead, had been revived by those who practiced the old ways, and I was alive, was impossibly alive. And the woman who had saved me said I had been chosen, had been saved because I had resisted at the end, had refused to accept, had shown that I understood what was being done to me was not holy. And she said many were called to resist, but few actually did, because the training ran so deep. Because acceptance had been so thoroughly taught that even facing death people submitted. And my refusal, my anger, my final rejection of the narrative had marked me as someone worth saving, someone who could be taught, someone who could transform acceptance into resistance, submission into strength. I learned from her and others like her that what I had been taught was not faith but control, was not God's will but human manipulation, was a system designed to make victims compliant, to make oppression seem inevitable, to make people accept harm as if it were blessing. And I learned too that God, if God existed, would not require submission to injustice, would not demand acceptance of cruelty, would not call abuse holy. And the faith I had lost in my cell was not real faith but indoctrination. And losing it had freed me, had allowed me to see clearly, had made it possible for me to choose rather than simply accept. And choosing, I learned, was the most sacred thing, was the real gift God gave humans, and taking away that choice, making people accept what they would not choose, that was the real sin. That was what the ministers and my parents and everyone who praised my acceptance had been doing. They had been sinning by removing my ability to choose, by praising my submission, by calling my trained helplessness virtue. I stayed dead to Salem, stayed dead to my parents who had been proud of my acceptance, stayed dead to the church that had taught me submission was holiness. And I built a new life, built it with people who believed that resistance was sacred, that choosing was divine, that saying no was sometimes the most faithful thing you could do. And I learned to want things, learned to take up space, learned to refuse, and every refusal felt like prayer, felt like worship, felt like what God actually wanted, which was people who chose goodness rather than people who accepted whatever they were told was good. And I survived because I finally stopped accepting, finally started resisting, finally understood that God's will and human convenience were not the same thing. And I would never confuse them again, would never accept suffering as blessing, would never submit to injustice and call it faith. And perhaps that made me less godly in their eyes, but it made me more alive, more whole, more actually capable of real faith rather than trained compliance. And I carry this understanding, carry it as the most valuable thing I own, carry it as the truth that saved me, that acceptance is not always virtue, that submission is not always faith, that sometimes the most holy thing you can do is refuse, is resist, is say no to what they call God's will and insist on justice instead. And I teach this to others, teach them that they were not made to be sacrifices, were not created to accept harm, were not designed to submit without question. And some of them hear me and some do not. Some are too deeply trained in acceptance to recognize it as training. But those who hear, those who understand, those who learn to resist, they survive, they thrive. They become what humans were meant to be, which is choosing beings rather than accepting ones. And that, I believe, is what God actually wanted all along. People who chose love rather than accepted hate. Who chose justice rather than accepted oppression. Who chose life rather than accepted death. And my story is proof that choosing is possible. That acceptance can be broken. That training can be overcome. That even at the very end, even with the noose around your neck, you can still say no, can still resist, can still refuse to accept what they call God's will. And that refusal can save you, can transform you, can make you more faithful than any acceptance ever could.